The Soviet Union's first communist leader was Vladimir Lenin, who toppled the old Russian Empire in November 1917 and built the world's first socialist state. For a few years, he was unstoppable. Revolutionary icon, mastermind of the Red Army, architect of a new world order. But power and paranoia ate away at him fast. After a string of strokes, he was sidelined by his own comrades, watching helplessly as Joseph Stalin maneuvered into place as his heir. By the time he died in 1924, at just 53, Lenin was a broken figure, sick, bitter, and warning against the very man who would take everything he built and twist it further. His embalmed corpse was put on display in Moscow, turned into a shrine, while his political legacy was carved up and repurposed by Stalin to cement his own dictatorship. Albania's first communist leader was Enver Hoxha, who seized power in 1945 and turned the country into Europe's most paranoid dictatorship. He broke with the Yugoslavs, Soviets, and the Chinese, cut Albania off from the outside world, and blanketed the countryside with 700,000 bunkers. Religion was outlawed, dissent was crushed, and even beards were banned if they didn't fit his image. Hoxha ruled for 40 years in total isolation until his death in 1985. By then, Albania was dirt poor, cut off from its neighbours, and frozen in time. The last Stalinist state in Europe, built entirely in Stalin's image. Yugoslavia's first communist leader was Josip Broz Tito, and unlike most of Eastern Europe's communists, he didn't owe his power to Stalin. Tito rose from a partisan commander during World War II, leading one of the most effective resistance movements in occupied Europe. When the war ended, he built a socialist federation of 6 republics and kept the Soviets at bay. By 1948, he openly broke with Stalin, the only leader in Eastern Europe daring enough to do so. Instead of being crushed, Tito played East and West against each other, winning aid from both sides of the Cold War. At home, he ran a tighter ship than his Western admirers liked to admit. Political opponents were jailed, dissent was silenced, and the infamous prison island of Goliatok became a warning to anyone suspected of pro-Soviet leanings. Still, Tito's cult of personality and his vision of brotherhood and unity kept Yugoslavia together. He ruled until his death in 1980, when hundreds of world leaders attended his funeral, the largest state funeral in history at the time. Without Tito, the federation he built slowly unraveled, collapsing violently in the 1990s. Hungary's first experiment with communism came in 1919, when Belo Kun, a fiery journalist fresh from exile in Russia, declared the Hungarian Soviet Republic. He promised equality, land reform, and a workers' paradise. What he delivered was chaos instead. Food shortages, mass nationalizations, and a brutal red terror where suspected opponents were rounded up, beaten, and executed. Kun bragged about exporting revolution into neighbouring countries, but instead, Romanian troops marched into Budapest after just 133 days. Kun fled with state funds, begged Lenin for another shot, and eventually washed up in Moscow, where Stalin later had him executed. But Hungary got a second round of communism in 1947, this time with Matthias Rákosi, one of Kun's old comrades. Rákosi proudly called himself Stalin's best pupil, and he lived up to it. He built a full-blown police state, unleashed secret police, packed prisons, and staged endless show trials. If Kun's regime was a short, chaotic burst, Rákosi's was a slow suffocation. Rákosi fled Hungary after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 though, and was banned from returning under Khrushchev's orders, so he later died in USSR in 1971. Bulgaria's first communist leader was Georgi Dimitrov, a man who made his name long before taking power. In 1933, the Nazis accused him of starting the Reichstag fire. Instead of crumbling, he turned the trial into a stage, publicly humiliating Göring and defending communism to a global audience. He walked out of the court a hero in the international press and left-leaning circles. After World War II, Dimitrov returned to Bulgaria as Stalin's loyal ally. He toyed with the idea of creating a Balkan federation with Tito's Yugoslavia, a communist superstate in southeastern Europe, but the project collapsed once Tito and Stalin split in 1948. Dimitrov remained firmly in Stalin's orbit, building a one-party state and crushing opposition at home. In 1949, Dimitrov travelled to Moscow and suddenly died there, officially from illness. The timing sparked conspiracy theories though, with some whispering that Stalin had him silenced. Either way, he was the first leader of the Eastern Bloc to die. Dimitrov's death left the stage open for Todor Zivkov, who would go on to rule Bulgaria for the next 35 years, the longest-serving leader in the Eastern Bloc. Germany's first flirtation with communism came in January 1919, when the Spartacus under Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht attempted to seize power in Berlin, but the uprising collapsed within days. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were arrested, beaten, and murdered, their bodies dumped in a canal. Their revolution died in a week, but their martyrdom turned them into a communist icon for decades. More serious was the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic that started that same year, where revolutionaries led by Eugen Levin briefly declared a socialist state in Munich before being crushed by the army and the Freikorps. Levin was arrested and later shot in June that year, with his last words being, "We communists are all dead men on leave." Damn, G. Fast forward to 1949, and communism returned, this time to stay for a while. With Stalin's backing, Walter Ulbricht took control of East Germany, better known as the German Democratic Republic. Ulbricht wasn't a romantic revolutionary like Rosa Luxemburg. He was a hardline Stalinist bureaucrat ruling through censorship, secret police, and forced conformity. Bro was so unpopular that it was difficult for the East German government to build him a personality cult because he was 5'5" and had a high-pitched voice. He even oversaw the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, a propaganda disaster that locked millions inside his grey little state. By the early 1970s, Moscow quietly pushed him aside, but not before he had turned the dream of Germany's communist martyrs into a surveillance state built on fear and concrete. Romania's communist era began with Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, a hardline Stalinist who rose from prisons and underground cells to absolute power. In 1947, under Soviet pressure, King Michael was forced to abdicate from Romania, and according to Enver Hoxha, Gheorghe-Dej himself held him at gunpoint. That moment ended Romania's monarchy and sealed its submission to Moscow. Gheorghiu-Dej ruled with terror, secret police, censorship, and labor camps crushed opposition. Yet, by the early 1960s, he cautiously broke from Moscow, opening trade with the West and carving out a degree of independence. He died of lung cancer in 1965, leaving Nicolae Ceausescu to inherit his machinery of repression and twist it into a suffocating personality cult. Czechoslovakia's first communist flicker came in 1919 with the short-lived Slovak Soviet Republic. Backed by Bela Kun's Hungary, it barely lasted a month before collapsing under military pressure. It was more a footnote than a revolution. The real turn came in 1948. Klement Gottwald, leader of the Communist Party, staged a coup in Prague. He promised democracy and a coalition government, but once he had power, he pulled the mask off, turning Czechoslovakia into a full Soviet satellite. Gottwald was a textbook Stalinist, party purges, censorship, secret police, and total loyalty to Moscow. In 1953, he travelled to Moscow to attend Stalin's funeral. Days later, Gottwald was dead too, officially from pneumonia. Rumours swirled though that he'd poisoned himself or simply breathed too much of Stalin's ghost. Either way, he became the first Eastern Bloc leader to literally follow his master to the grave, leaving Czechoslovakia locked firmly behind the Iron Curtain. Boleslav Bierut was Stalin's loyal puppet in Poland, installed after World War II on Red Army bayonets. A dull bureaucrat rather than a war hero, he rigged elections, jailed opponents, and turned Poland into a textbook Stalinist state full of secret police and show trials. Honestly, Bierut was pretty unremarkable and an office holder that just obeyed orders from his superiors in the USSR. But in 1956, Bierut visited Moscow, and during Khrushchev's secret speech, the cult of Stalin was denounced ruthlessly, and a few weeks later, Bierut suddenly dropped dead in Moscow, officially from a heart attack. Unofficially though, just another entry in the long, strange tradition of Eastern Bloc leaders who visited Moscow for something Stalin-related and never came back. San Marino's flirtation with communism was brief and bizarre. In 1945, after years of fascist rule, an election was held and the communists and socialists formed a coalition. Now, I actually couldn't find anything on who led this coalition at first, but it was probably one of these two guys, and I couldn't find a single article on either of them. This made San Marino one of the few countries in history to democratically place a communist leader in power. This unusual arrangement though lasted 12 years, ending when the communists lost power following the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, cementing the tiny state's status as a curious Cold War outlier.